All right, so we've got some serious business to cover here, and don't get any funny ideas about what's retro and what's not. You see, we retro gamers take what qualifies as retro very seriously. Why? Well, we like to know what it is that we like. If I'm a retro gamer, does that mean PS2 is part of the equation, or is the cutoff at Dreamcast? It's only natural that we'd want to define exactly what our hobby is, and it's also only natural that nobody agrees. Some people say something becomes retro after a certain number of years pass, while others say that it has more to do with the advancement of technology, aesthetic, and visual differences. Perhaps the difference between 2D and 3D with a cutoff after a specific console. And then there are people who say something can only be retro if they played it as a little kid. Sorry, but calling the Wii retro makes some of us feel like mega geezers. And then there are what I like to call the dictionary people. Those who have read the dictionary definition, which technically states that retro video games are, well, actually, not the older video games themselves, but rather newer video games that imitate older games. The issue with that is the meaning of words are not concrete. Language is fluid and ever-changing. Meanings get appropriated to mean different things based on how people are using the words, something that's been happening for literally all of time. And in the case of the word retro, the term has been appropriated by our community to include the actual older video games themselves. You want another fun example? The word awful at one point referred to something that was worthy of awe, like an awful bunch of bananas, something I'd never say nowadays. In any case, the entire point of language is to communicate meaning. So when I say Contra is a retro video game, everyone knows what I'm saying. But what about Metal Gear Solid 3? Things get a lot more divisive in terms of who does and does not think it's retro. If we were to approach it with the "a game is retro once it's a certain number of years old" logic, it would be just shy of 20 years old, a common cutoff I see people give for when a game becomes retro, and in which case, congratulations, Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War. You're now a retro game, released exactly 20 years ago on the same day as this video upload. Of course, even among the "a game needs to be old enough to be retro" folks, the cutoff for how many years old a game needs to be will vary. Some will suggest even more than 20 years, but like I said, a lot of people will say 20 years. Some will say 15 years, and people who are really frisky might even try to say 10 years. But these days, almost never will you see anything less than that. But if you did, who's gonna stop ya? In any case, the logic behind a game needing to be a certain number of years old comes from very sound reasoning. If a game is considered retro once it's older, then it needs to have a certain amount of oldness. So, simple solution for many folks is to just say this happens after a finite number of years. However, where I personally find myself disagreeing with this logic is that not all decades are created equal, and not in a pro-70s disco type of way. Think about what happened with video games during the 90s. At the beginning, we were finishing up with the NES, and at the end, we were getting ready for the PlayStation 2, and awkwardly enough, some people think Dreamcast games can look better than PS2 anyways. Then contrast that with the 2010s. We went through an entire decade without getting a slightly upgraded port of the original Red Dead Redemption, though to be fair, in a recent 10-year span, we did get Last of Us upgraded twice. Regardless, when thinking about what is and isn't considered retro, I do think the context of what happened during the years that have passed can be more significant than the mere fact that years have passed. If you think back to the late 90s, or if you weren't born till after, shout out to you, younger generation caring about retro games, you can take my word for it that the NES was considered old by the late 90s, despite having been supported with new games less than a decade before. The push for 3D came along, and in the eyes of a lot of people, made something like the NES feel so different, so outdated, so old. Thinking about video games in these terms, it's easy to see why people would think of retro video games as having a cutoff related to a specific console. The Dreamcast seems to be a popular choice among people. Diminishing returns does start to become a factor where we can only try to improve the visuals so much compared to what came before, and no matter how much we boost the fidelity of newer games, they're still gonna feel somewhat close to PS4 and heck, maybe even PS3 games for some people. I think this is why when a lot of people think of video games that are retro, they think of games that are 2D or maybe also include more rudimentary looking 3D as well. Of course, there are many other factors to consider that came as video game consoles have changed over the years as well, including, but not limited to, the controllers we use, the different genres of games that are emphasized, the approach to game design, the way online connectivity affects consoles, and perhaps even just the overall effect of the video game market having grown so much, making more recent consoles feel more like generic mass market boxes. There are people who will tell you that if you ignore Nintendo systems, game consoles haven't had a personality since the Dreamcast. PS5 might beg to disagree, but that sentiment is certainly out there. All that said, while some like to discern what is and is not retro based on the age of the consoles, there are those who like to base it on the age of themselves. People from younger generations might consider something like the PS3 retro because they played it when they were kids, which for them could feel like a long time ago, as opposed to someone older who might think, oh yeah, I remember when I played the PS3. I played that when I was old. Something else I've noticed when it comes to deciding what is and isn't retro is that people don't really care what other people think, not unlike plenty of other things. One of my favorite examples, though, is when people create their cutoff for what is and isn't retro based simply on what they like. Like, I don't really play anything newer than the Dreamcast anyways, so that works as a good cutoff for me. And sure, this preference might happen to coincide with other logic they have, but either way, the influence is certainly there for some people. But now that we've had an entire discussion about what is and isn't retro, I find now is a good opportunity to remind everyone that this is a conversation mostly for the sake of fun anyways, not a lot riding on it, and you probably won't change anyone's mind anyway, so don't get worked up in the comments. You'll find it's not very productive. You want something more productive? Try this. And like I've talked about before, some people don't even make the distinction between what is and isn't retro anyways, they just play video games. Something that could potentially be beneficial to the hobby because as much as some of us use the label of games being retro as a plus, unfortunately, others use it as a way to think of them as lesser. You know, folks who will say they don't like retro games. I can live with that. I mean, different strokes for different folks, am I right? That said, I would still be curious to hear what all of you consider to be retro. For questions like these, I always enjoy looking for trends among your answers to see where people are agreeing and disagreeing. So with that, leave your comment down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's the retro bird, oh yes, and he hopes that you like